Picture for a moment a teenager playing one-on-one basketball with his dad. His dad shoots and misses. The boy steps back, shoots, and it's a perfect shot. The son, taught by the father, is now better than the father. And in a brief moment, there is a glimpse of the future, a future when one-on-one games are no longer possible. A glimpse, perhaps, of that day when father and son meet not on a basketball court, but over a deathbed. There are those moments when, by a glance across the room, or the play of sunlight on a shadow, or the aroma of a favorite meal, the past, the present, the future are brought together, and we are made aware of a deeper, more profound reality. Such revelations are typically momentary, but we don't really need much more than a moment to be impacted. I believe there are times in life, often they are fleeting moments, when that curtain between today and tomorrow is drawn back, and we are given a glimpse of what lies ahead. These momentary glimpses can be startling. They can even be a bit puzzling, but they can also be blessed gifts of God. On this Sunday, before we enter into Lent, we acknowledge one of those glimpses as we look to the scriptural account we know as the Transfiguration. Now, biblically, the Transfiguration occurs right after Jesus asked the disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" Peter responded correctly when he said, "You are the Messiah of God." That was really an exciting revelation for the disciples. But then Jesus shocked them and spoiled that wonderful, wonderful revelation by telling his disciples that he must undergo great suffering and be rejected and be killed. And if that wasn't bad enough, the disciples were shocked even more when Jesus made it clear that they themselves would also have to suffer if they wanted to follow him. What in the world had they gotten themselves into? This was not the future they had pictured when they first started following Jesus. So it is with these disturbing thoughts freshly planted in their heads that Jesus then invites Peter and James and John to follow him up a high mountain. It certainly wasn't unusual for Jesus to get away, to think, to pray, and to experience quiet communion with God, his Father. Most often he did this by himself. But this time, and at least one additional time that we know of, he invited 3 others to accompany him. While on that mountain, Jesus suddenly began to radiate with the glory of God, and he is caught up in a spectacular event with 2 great but long dead figures of the Jewish faith, Moses and Elijah. To the Jews, Moses represented the blessed gift of God's law, a gift that set them apart as God's people. Elijah, as the greatest of all the prophets, represented the truth and the power of God's word. Their presence and the entire startling experience was short-lived. And when it was over, Jesus, the very pinnacle of God's salvation, was left standing alone. Now, Peter's initial response was to preserve that moment by building 3 memorial-type structures, one for each of those 3 great men of faith. But such moments are not meant to be captured or preserved like that. Now, perhaps it was the look on Jesus' face as Peter suggested it, or perhaps it was the voice coming from the cloud saying, "This is my son, the beloved, listen to him," that convinced Peter to just forget about those structures and take a moment, live in the moment. Either way, Peter got the point. In one unexpected, stunning moment, the transfiguration reassures Peter, James, and John, and all of us who continue to ponder that holy happening today, that God's purpose always has and always will find fulfillment. We cannot know exactly what lies ahead, but we can know that the one who led us in the past is with us in the present and has plans to be with us for our future. Those plans may not be easy, but because they are God's plans, there is hope and there is life. For a few holy moments, 3 disciples not only saw who Jesus really was, they were also assured that what lies ahead, what we now know to be suffering, death, and resurrection, were all according to God's plans. Following the transfiguration, the 3 disciples and Jesus, they left the mountain. They went back down into the valley where there were sick people to heal, hungry people to feed, teachings to be shared, disputes among the disciples to be settled, and a lot more work to be done. And as Jesus had already promised, there was suffering and there was death. There was no way to freeze the mountaintop moment in time, to somehow capture that radiance and make it last forever. They had to go back down the mountain with nothing more to sustain them than just a glimpse, one shining, very strange, and yet holy moment when the veil separating past, present, and future was thrown back. On rare occasions, God comes to us, and we are stunned by perhaps blinding lights, a thundering voice, by a presence that is completely impossible to miss. But more often, God comes to us and quietly pulls back for just a peek that curtain between earth and heaven, between today and eternity. When such a glimpse is given to us, whether it is on a mountaintop in Judea, during a worship service on a Sunday morning, while watching a beautiful sunrise, or walking along a gentle stream, while sitting alongside a dying loved one, or even while playing one-on-one basketball, we are invited to cherish those glimpses as blessed gifts. It truly is powerful and mostly inexplicable to come face to face with the living God and become aware of a reality that is beyond our current experience, a reality that is eternal. Jesus knew this, and he knew those disciples needed both time and upcoming experiences to process and to better understand what happened on the mountain. So he told them to tell no one about what they had seen until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. Even though such experiences can never be fully grasped or described by our human mind and vocabulary, they are nonetheless, throughout the ages, been the experiences of those who worship the living God. In fact, it really is the case that whenever God's people worship, whether we are gathered with a group or by ourselves, in one place or virtually, we proclaim the presence of the living God, and we anticipate personal encounters and revelations. Now, it's certainly understandable that Peter wanted his glimpse of God's glory to continue and to be marked in some significant way. Perhaps you have wanted the same thing following a meaningful encounter with God while attending church camp, an inspiring concert or speech, a mission trip, a Habitat Build Day. Perhaps it's been on a Sunday morning when the words of a hymn make you aware of another reality, when a prayer seems to transport you into the very presence of God, when your participation in Holy Communion reveals a future reality of full communion with God. I would even like to think that once in a while, there have been those times when you were actually a bit sad when the sermon ended, because you absolutely knew God was speaking directly to you and you wanted to hear more. After such moments, you might wish you could tell others exactly how your heart was strangely warmed and why you feel different, even changed. But it's hard to put into words. And in all truth, it's likely impossible for someone else to fully grasp why such a moment had such meaningful impact on you. So you cherish your glimpses of God, and you go back into the valley, which is your home, your workplace, perhaps school, but you are different because for a shining moment, you encountered the living God, and you glimpsed something of God's glory, and you knew that the future is filled with hope. Of course, those mountain-type moments, those experiences, as we often like to call them, do not eliminate all of our doubts, our concerns, our struggles in this life. We still don't have and will never have in this life all the answers. We couldn't possibly build our whole faith on such unexpected, sporadic glimpses any more than we could build the whole story of Jesus around what happened in just a few transfiguring moments on a mountain. But it makes a difference to have seen, even if only for a moment, a future radiating with the hope-filled presence of God. It makes a difference to have heard the voice of God. Without times of renewal, like those given by God during times of worship, we would not be able to faithfully endure everyday life at the bottom of the mountain, which is most of our life. We would not be able to walk the way of the cross. We would not be able to bear the burden of life's suffering, disappointments, pain, and death. You know, we tend to think that the real world is someplace other than church, something different than the prayer and music that touches our hearts, lifts our spirits, and makes us aware of a different reality. But could it be that worship is our regular and desperately needed dose of God's reality? A reality that then enables us to head back out to face the sad and sinful illusions of everyday life. Back in the early days of the civil rights movement in Mississippi, busloads of white activists arrived in the South from the North to help in that struggle for justice. They came to place themselves on the line, to join hands with black brothers and sisters. They came to march to risk imprisonment and possibly even injury and death. They were prepared for almost anything, but many of them were not prepared for the hours they would be crowded into churches to sing and to pray and to sing some more. Many of the Northern activists said, well, all the singing and praying and preaching is fine if you like that sort of thing, but what in the world does this have to do with the real business at hand? Why are we here in the sanctuary when we could be marching on the streets? Some of those well-intentioned northern activists, they struggled with all the worship. But others knew well that more than 300 years of evil would not be wiped out in one march to Jackson. It was preaching and prayers and songs that kept them going for all those years that would keep them going, even though there were struggles and disappointments ahead. And so they sang. They sang their spirituals, like "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot," and "We Shall Overcome." And they sang words such as, "Precious Lord, take my hand. Lead me on, let me stand. I am tired, I am weak, I am worn. Through the storm, through the night, lead me on to the light. Take my hand, precious Lord, lead me home." They withdrew for worship so that they might return to the world with renewed perseverance and a hope-filled vision of God's future. Perhaps that's why once the way got long and hard, once the cameras focused on topics elsewhere, most of those northern activists got back on their buses and they headed home. Now, it was not that they no longer cared. They cared. They were just tired. Their eager humanitarian impulses and their good intentions just gave out. And there was nothing left to sustain them, to strengthen them. Without precious, much-needed times of withdrawal, renewal, and fresh vision, such as God gives us in times of worship, we are not able to faithfully endure life in the valley. Today's strange mountaintop revelation happens on the way to the cross. The pace now quickens. The end of the drama comes into view. It is a tragedy that will end in Jesus' death and in the scattering and the disillusionment of the disciples. But on the way there, we are startled. We are blessed by a dazzling event that causes us, all of us, to look beyond the struggles and the suffering of life to a different reality, one that is filled with glorious hope and resurrection life. Now, when today's postlude ends, and this live stream is all over, and your focus is diverted elsewhere, it may well become clear that this is an ordinary, cold, pandemic day in February. And nothing may seem visibly different today from when you opened yourself to God's presence by entering into worship this morning. But might you be different? You may not go around telling everyone about the difference, but others may notice. Do you remember how the people of Israel couldn't help but notice the glow on Moses following his encounters with God? Even after deciding to wear a veil so as not to startle people too much following his time with God, people still knew. They knew by what he had to say. They knew by what he did. What does a God encounter glow look like on you? Is it noticeable to your family, your neighbors, friends, co-workers, acquaintances, and even strangers? It really should be. Because even small doses of God's glory and occasional glimpses of eternity, like the ones we are given by way of weekly worship, can be enough to reassure us of God's presence, to give us hope, to impact us in ways that are noticeable. Yes, it may seem as though we are always returning to an unchanged world. And yet, we return as those changed by our glimpses of a future filled with the promise of resurrection life. So I am so glad that you made time to worship today, because this time that we have had together in God's presence may be as real as it gets for the rest of this week. So thanks be to God, who blesses us with glimpses of eternity, glimpses of that day when God's presence will fill all of our moments. Amen.